This is Dune Talk, a DuneNewsNet.com production. Join us now for the latest Dune news, reactions, and lively discussions.
Hey there, welcome to a special episode of Dune Talk. The Dune saga has captured the imaginations of multiple generations, whether it's true to words on the book's pages or their movie and TV adaptations. And the story behind all of it is just as fascinating. In a brand new book, The Spice Must Flow, the story of Dune from cult novels to visionary sci-fi movies, author Ryan Britt looks at the 60-year history of Frank Herbert's epic science fiction saga, from inspirations of the original book to its 5 sequels and multiple journeys to the big and small screen. And yes, Ryan is joining us today. This is Marcus, your editor at DuneNewsNet.com, and I'm also joined by Mark, a longtime fan of all things Dune.
Hi, glad to be back on again with yet another Dune book. It's a Dune season at the moment, so very happy to speak to Ryan about his excellent book.
As mentioned, we're really excited to have Ryan on as our special guest today. He's been writing about science fiction for many, many years, and his published works include books on Star Wars and Star Trek. Dune fans, you may have seen his articles on Inverse and Den of Geek. Ryan, welcome to Dune Talk. I know our viewers and listeners are interested to hear a bit more about you. How would you describe yourself, whether it's work or interests, in a minute?
Well, thanks for having me, Mark and Marcus. I guess I am a mentat by training, a human computer of entertainment journalism. I'm an entertainment journalist with an emphasis on, science fiction, and I've been doing that for a little over a decade. And so I guess that's the easy way of describing myself.
And Ryan, as always for guests on the show, we want to hear your Dune story. What got you invested in this epic saga?
I think that I distinctly remember when the Sci-Fi Channel Dune was coming out in 2000 and being aware and having seen scenes from the 84 film, but never really understanding it. I graduated high school in the year 2000. And so that was a big year. And I was working at a Barnes & Noble as a 17 and an 18-year-old. And everybody I worked with were big science fiction fantasy readers. And everybody seemed to know everything there was about Dune or Lord of the Rings or various other things. And so around that time, everybody's like, oh, this is going to be a very serious adaptation of this very serious science fiction novel. And I didn't really put any of this in my book, but that was what it was for me, is that I felt, I was 18 years old. I was becoming a grown-up. And here was this novel that all of these cooler, older guys were like telling me was like the most important sci-fi novel ever. And it made Star Wars look like kid stuff. And so for me, that was probably my Dune awakening. That was my origin story for sure. And then, of course, becoming kind of obsessed that summer after I graduated from high school, and then, watching the Lynch film and loving it as well. But I remember buying the VHS tapes, the giant brick of 2 VHS tapes of the Sci-Fi Channel version, of the William Hurt version. I wish I still had them.
Awesome. So we have plenty of questions to cover today. So let's jump into The Spice Must Flow. So you mentioned the sci-fi miniseries, and that was now more than 20 years ago. Like when you were like having the spark to inspire your book, were you sort of like obsessed with it the whole like this 20 years, or was sort of, for example, the Denis Villeneuve movie like an awakening point for you to?
Well, it was certainly an awakening point professionally, because in my business, when a new franchise, reboots itself, and I'm one of the people on one of the publications that can write about it at length, I'm immediately like, well, now I'm invested again. The same was true back in 2017 when Star Trek sort of had a TV comeback. I was like, well, I know a lot about Star Trek. I'm going to start, really getting kind of back into this. And by getting back in, I mean reading everything. You know what I mean? So, yeah, that said, I consistently have reread the first couple of Dune novels every few years since I was an adolescent. I was in New York City for a big chunk of from my 20s to my late 30s. And all my sort of like literary novelist friends, that was their one sci-fi novel that they loved. And so I had a lot of novelist friends in New York, and we talked about Dune a lot. So it never went away. You know what I mean? It's never like, I was never like, oh, I hate Dune, or I'm over Dune, or I'm out of my Dune phase. It was always there. and I would always rewatch the Lynch film, and I would always be really interested. And I was even kind of apprehensive at first about the Denis idea, because I was like, I don't know, I like Arrival, but what's that going to be like? You know what I mean? Because things shift very quickly in terms of the way we, when that was just a rumor and Blade Runner 2049 was out, it was kind of like, well, what's that going to be like? So I was interested, though, just as a journalist, just as a reporter, like, what's this going to be like? And then, yeah, like when I got to talk to Timothy in 2021, like I was just sort of like, that was transformative for me, just because I was like, oh, wow, this is a very big movie star in a very, what used to be a very niche science fiction idea, and I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, and as mentioned, there are a couple of books coming out about Dune in this period, but how did you decide on the scope of basically covering the entirety of Dune's 60-year history?
Because I like to make my life hard, because I like to invite scorn of other people. No, because it had just never been done. Because I felt what I liked about revisiting Dune throughout my 20s and 30s, and what I liked about the excitement of people getting back into the books, with the new films coming out, was that it reminded me of how it is this crossover novel, right? Like it is the ultimate crossover science fiction novel in every way. And in many ways, the ultimate crossover science fiction series, if you consider the fact that Star Wars wouldn't exist without it, right? Like, if that's like if Star Wars is a surrogate Dune, then Dune is the biggest science fiction thing ever, and it certainly has a lot of influences. And Star Trek is in Doctor Who are in competition there as well. But because it has roots in literature, whereas Star Wars and Doctor Who and Star Trek do not, Dune is therefore like more artistically fascinating to me. But within all of that, I did feel that there was just never a every person's book about it. Brian Herbert's biography of his father is wonderful, but it is not a book about Dune, right? Like it is a book about Frank Herbert. And I thought, I want to write something for everybody that knows nothing about this. Everything is very specific. Jodorowsky's Dune, the documentary, is about this one thing. So I just felt that there was nothing that a younger version of me, a 17-year-old version of me, could go to and reach for, or a sort of casual fan. I have a great friend of mine is the novelist Karen Russell, and she loves Dune, and I would tell her these factoids about how it was written, and she's like, I didn't know any of that. You know what I mean? So a book for someone like her, a book for someone like my wife, who is a poet and is interested in art, in visual art, and love the new film. And my wife, Mary, doesn't have the patience perhaps to sit through a documentary like Jodorowsky's Dune, perhaps doesn't have the patience to sift through the sequel novels, but is interested in it. So I tried to think as a very generalist audience. And that's also kind of my thing. I do that in my online writing. I've done it in my previous two books. I had just done it with Star Trek, which was also extremely ambitious and difficult. And I just saw it as an opportunity to say, why not? If I don't do it, someone else will do it.
Mark, before you fire off your first questions, you wrote a written review about the book on DuneNewsNet.com. What were your overall impressions?
So a great book, and incredibly, even though you've covering those 60 years, you are touching on bits of information that are either glossed over in other books or documentaries, or just never surfaced at all. So I know we'll talk about it later about the ecological aspects of Dune and the origin, and also how the story of that was revised over his sequels. The reception of Dune Messiah, and how Frank Herbert twisted expectations and so on throughout the series. Stuff in here about the unmade adaptations, both the Jodorowsky ones and ones by Peter Berg as well, which again there's not much out there. So yeah, for anyone interested in any aspect of Dune, it's a great read and highly recommended.
Wouldn't exist without people like this podcast, or without people like Mark at Dune Info, right? Like, it's also like a little bit of a love letter to all the people that document these things, right? That go online and document them and that don't make it into your average online article or an EW piece or something like that. So I think that was another thing with it is I wanted to, I did a lot of original reporting for it, but I also, a lot of these people aren't alive, so you have to do what you can. And one of my philosophies is just always like, well, whatever's on the Wikipedia page is completely out of context, but that seems to be what everybody will repeat. And so then it's always like, I'll never forget being in college and getting a collection of John Lennon's interviews. And there's all these, it's like some of his last ones he did for Playboy. And there's all these quotes, right, that you've seen a million times out of context. And then you see them in context and you're like, this is totally different. And I that's kind of like what I like to do with all of my entertainment writing, all of my pop culture writing, specifically this book, is say, you've heard all of this, but what is the context? Let's talk about it. Let's talk about it in a new light. Let's try to find other information to support it. Let's have some theories and stuff like that. So I appreciate that comment, Mark, but also like people like you that do a lot of archival work are part of how I stand on the shoulders of people like you and in this podcast in a way.
Yeah, thank you. So you've interviewed many people for the book. Was there any particular interviewee or a highlight that stood out to you while you were creating the book?
Well, I mean, getting a hold of Kyle MacLachlan was obviously pretty cool. I was determined after I'd interviewed Timothée Chalamet for a Den of Geek cover story in 2021, and that gave me the genesis of like wanting to do the book and talking to Denis. I was like, oh, I could take some of what I didn't use these interviews. I could make a whole book. This could be great. I had gotten Alec Newman, and he was great. I'm sure, as you guys know, Alec Newman is amazing, a humble, wonderful human being. But getting Kyle was the holy grail. I was kind of like, if I don't get all three Pauls for this book that is about all of Dune, like, who am I? Like, I failed, So I tracked down Kyle through the Dune Reddit folks who were really awesome because they had done an AMA with him, which was funny because his AMA was like the day my previous book was coming out, and I couldn't go to the AMA because I was doing an event for my previous book. So I just hounded the Reddit people. They were so helpful. And then Kyle's reps were great. So talking to Kyle for over an hour, just about everything was amazing because he's exactly as you would think of him, where he's just funny. He's a real fan. He starts kind of shit talking like Star Wars, ripping Dune off. And like, that was just, he's like, oh man, even in The Mandalorian and Boba Fett, they're ripping off sandworms. He's just so great. He's one of us, you know what I mean? In a very real way, he is one of us. And I think that, and if you like his other work, if you like Twin Peaks or you like his, the other, Blue Velvet, you're just like, it's Kyle MacLachlan, he's a legend, Portlandia, so I think that was definitely the highlight. I mean, he's one of the coolest readers and thoughtful artists around.
Yeah, it's a great interview with him in there, and he's a great character. One of my favourite interviews in the book, which was surprising for me, was Theresa Shackleford's, Frank Herbert's third wife, I think, his last wife. Yes. And she's sometimes mentioned in books, but this is the first time I think I've read an interview with her. So I'm just wondering, what was the process like of tracking her down, and any highlights from that?
Yeah, so it's Theresa, which I didn't know.
Sorry.
No, you wouldn't know that. It's Theresa. I didn't know that until I was on Zoom with her. It's Theresa Shackleford. What I did is there was a local paper that had interviewed her, where she lives in the South, and around the time the first Denis film came out. And I tracked down the journalist who talked to her, and I said on LinkedIn, and I said, hey, you talked to Theresa Shackleford. I'm doing this book. It's not an official book. My publisher is the same parent publisher that has the rights to the Frank Herbert books through Ace, but I didn't have to get, Brian Herbert didn't read this book. He was aware of it. The estate was aware of it. They were like, you guys can do whatever you want, but we're not going to participate in it, which was fine. Because as a journalist, that gives you a little bit more freedom, right? You do official books, it's a little harder. So I had interviewed a journalist who had interviewed Theresa a year prior, And I said, hey, can you give me your contact information? I didn't hear anything for 9 months, and had given up. And then I just got an email from Theresa in my inbox, and she said, hey, it's really kind of you. I just got this journalist just reached out to me, said, you're doing a book about Dune. I'd love to talk about Frank. I always love to talk about Frank. Anytime anybody wants to talk to me about Frank, I want to talk about Frank. And so there's this myth about her, right? That she's this unapproachable person. And the reality is just that she was much younger than Frank when she married him in the last few years of his life. And so, people make a lot of assumptions about that. They would make a lot of assumptions that, he had been having an affair with her while married to Beverly. Not true. Not true at all. She was a publicist working on the books when Heretics came out, or what? Yes, and she was like, when Heretics came out, and so she was assigned him, and this was right after Beverly died, and this is all in my book. But it's like her story is so interesting. She didn't want to date him. She thought that he was kind of out of her age range, and they just kind of they fell in love in this unexpected way. And I think that, Mark, you probably remember this in the book, is I kind of liken her to Princess Irulan in a way, because she's like the person that we don't think of as the one true love of Frank Herbert. We think of Beverly Herbert as the one true love of Frank Herbert. In many ways, that's accurate. And Theresa sort of supports that view as well. She was like, he would be nothing without Beverly, and he would have never looked at me had Beverly still been alive. So she's a very vibrant, intelligent, funny, kind, cool person, and I was really, it was another goal of mine. I was like, well, let's talk to the last person who Frank Herbert was married to, who went with him to the premiere of Dune in '84. They weren't married yet. They were dating at that time, who met Kyle and, I think that she felt like Brian, she replaced their mother, and they didn't like that, perhaps. I didn't feel like getting into that family drama in what I wrote. But just, you asked what was it like talking to her. She talked a little bit about that, but she also really loves her family, and Frank's son. And but yeah, I think we get a tendency to think that Frank Herbert was all one thing, and she showed me that he was more.
Yeah, excellent interview, and to take Frank Herbert's life right from the start, right to his death in the book is a fascinating read, and I think she's a crucial part of those last few years of his life.
Yeah, and she's also, because she was younger than him, it's interesting because she remembers things differently, right, than perhaps some folks who are older, or had he lived, she has a very contemporary view on it, because she was 29, when they were married, or almost 30. Anyway, it's really interesting. She's cool. I really like her. I'm very grateful to her.
And Ryan, you talked about Dune, how it sometimes feels like an open secret. Like there's so many references in pop culture. For example, everybody knows what a sandworm is, and where the still suit comes from, even if they've never experienced the story for themselves. Yet at the same time, Dune remains elusive to so many. It seems to be tied to some old misconceptions that the book is somehow difficult to read or inaccessible. Do you believe that the full depth and rich themes of the Dune saga will ever make it to the mainstream, to be understood in the public consciousness, let's say to the extent of franchises like Star Wars or Star Trek?
Do I think it has the potential to be understood and appreciated as much as those?
Yeah.
I think so. Yeah, because we're seeing that now, right? Like, in theory, the 2021 film that was originally a 2020 film, and the 2023 film that's now a 2024 film, it's just like, Dune's got a Dune. Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing that that's true. You don't have a movie. That movie wasn't supposed to be successful, right? It was like COVID had killed it. It was coming out on HBO Max at the same time as the theaters. Villeneuve was furious. We didn't know if we were going to get part 2. It was very uncertain, and it did great globally. It had a great global box office, and the HBO Max streams were amazing. I had so many texts, and I didn't know I was going to be doing this book at that time. I was like, oh, let's see how this works out. But I was kind of like, it's probably going to underperform. And once again, Dune's going to be misunderstood. And we'll never know if it would have done well if COVID hadn't happened. But I was wrong. It did well. It did really well. And I think that proved. I remember watching it. I saw it in the theater twice, once at a press screening and then once when it came out. And then I watched it at home with my wife. And she said the smartest thing. And she said, it's the anti-Marvel. It's the anti-quippy Star Wars. And she was like, it's so refreshing. And I remember her saying that to me, and I was like, that's why it's cool. That is exactly it. Because she hadn't seen the Lynch film in years and never read the novel. And she was like, that was great. That's what we've been missing with these kinds of movies. That there's not, I love Oscar Isaac in The Force Awakens too. But it was nice that in Dune 2001, 2021, we don't have a lot of silly comedy or Marvel quips. They didn't do that to it. It was more earnest. And it should be. And I thought that it had the right level of wit and the right level of earnestness. And that is rare. Because I love Trek, but tonally Trek is all over the place, and it can be funny, it can be serious. Tonally, Star Wars is all over the place. Dune has a tone. It has a very specific tone, and I think I think Denis' film nails that tone, and I think that people who were uninterested in it were like, "That's adult science fiction. That's what I wanted." And so yes, I think it won't. I don't know if you're going to have a Dune convention. But conventions are also misleading, right? Because they're like, well, here are the hardcore fans. I think that Dune fans are quote unquote normal people. And that's why it's actually in a weird way more powerful, because you don't need a Dune convention. It's just that big. It doesn't even need it.
In my view, when I was reading your book, it feels quite accessible for general audiences, and I think that you said that's your intention. Although it does explore the story of some of the later books, but at the same time, it does uncover some new insights for those of us who are already hardcore fans. I learned a lot myself going through the book. So thinking about those two different types of readers, like general audiences versus hardcore fans, what do you hope will be the biggest takeaway for each of those audiences?
Well, I hope a general reader will lighten up on this drumbeat that Dune is somehow hard and inaccessible, because it's just not true. I mean, I just think that it's nuts that people say that. It's nuts. Like, have you read the first page? It's gripping. It's wonderful. And that's, have you read the first page of Children of Dune? It's gripping. It's fantastic. So I hope that for general audiences who are like, oh, in the same way that, like, the Peter Jackson films shook everybody up about pretending like Lord of the Rings was hard to understand. You know what I mean? It was like, 1998, your grandma might not have known who Saruman was. 2002, your grandma knew who Saruman was. You know what I mean? And I think that, like, the Denis films, have done that for, I say this in the book. Just think about Duncan, Idaho. Think about how Duncan, Idaho just doesn't exist visually before this film. No shade to the previous Duncans at all. But come on, Momoa is Duncan in this way that, like, makes him, in the same way that MacLachlan made Gandalf, like, we really. So I think that my book is just saying, yes, this is a very big, very easy, in some way. I mean, I can follow Dune better than I can follow Game of Thrones, to be perfectly honest with you. Like, I get a little bit bored with Game of Thrones. But so yes, Dune is greater and more artistic than all those things, all 6 classic books. For hardcore fans, I hope that they maybe allow themselves to have parallel contradictory thoughts about the saga and about Herbert and about everything. Because I do think that some conversations I've had tend to be like, here's the one correct reading of God Emperor, or here's what Herbert really meant, or, and I'm like, yeah, but what makes Dune cool is that there's so many contradictions and there's so many takeaways, and that I think that we could stand to be okay with that. Like, to be like, hey, it's okay to have different readings. It's okay for people to quote unquote have read the first novel wrong. Because Herbert's playing 2 games often, and sometimes with less intentionality than I think we've been led to believe. And so, and also just to appreciate um, the time in which it was made, and that where he was in the spectrum of science fiction writers is the dawn of the new wave, the dawn of like science fiction becoming less clunky and more artistic and literary. And Herbert to me is he's the epicenter of that, right? Because he's got a foot in the old Campbell camp of things, but then like, have you guys seen the Foundation show on Apple? No, well, so like I think it's great. I think it's wonderful, but it's also way better than the novels and the Asimov novels. Herbert was way better than Asimov as a writer. I don't care. I love Asimov. I have like 5 billion Asimov books. Anybody can come after me there. But I was trying to say, look how great he was as just a writer at this time, and not just a science fiction writer. And so I hope people, and just the miracle that it even happened. I hope that people, hardcore fans, are like, no, it's really weird the way that it happened. It's even weirder than you think. I hope people think about that, because that was fascinating to me, going through all the letters and piecing that all together was really cool.
Right. You mentioned the different readings of the first Dune novel, and you're in an unusual position of actually having interviewed all three Paul Atreides. And I'm just wondering how you think I'm not going to ask you to name your favourite Paul, but just how do you think each actor approached Dune differently?
I think that Alec probably is the only one to date who approached it with a slightly more organic feeling, because, and this is in the book, is he said that he didn't really know much about Dune, so he was kind of arrogant about it, and also sort of confused because he was supposed to be playing a little younger. So all of that awkwardness, I think, actually works, in his performance. And then when he gets to, the Children of Dune miniseries, which covers Messiah and Children of Dune, he gets to be the older Paul, and then he gets to be the preacher. To say what you will about those performances, I think that he gets to, again, organically have that journey with that character without really knowing where it was going. I think Kyle's is the most probably emotionally vibrant, because he was Paul. He was obsessed with the book as a slightly younger man. He lived in Seattle, Caladan, and then he had to go to the desert to do Dune, and it was his first movie, and it's coming of age. It's, come on, like that. He is Paul. So I think for that is the most probably emotionally vibrant performance, even if it's the least. And I think his approach probably was that it's probably the least, sort of faithful or whatever. And then I think with Timothy, I think that Timothy's is probably the most literary. I think it's probably the one that's probably closest to the book. And I think that Timothy is a reader. You know what I mean? Not obviously Kyle's a super fan. They're all readers, don't get me wrong. But Timothy, like, it's not like he was like a big Dune fan, but he's like he's a book guy, and so I think that he was reading Messiah during lockdown to try to figure it out. So I think that I think he's probably, like, if you're thinking about it like as a stage play, Timothy is your best Paul. And I know that's weird because it's like the most sophisticated of the films, but or at least technologically. But does that a good answer? That was a weird answer.
No, it makes perfect sense. You talked about Kyle going from Caladan to Arrakis and that change in ecology. And in your book, you talk about how Frank Herbert took on a little bit of the revisionist history and the importance of the ecology in his novel. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that what I mean, and there's some contradictions in there, as I've said. I think that Frank Herbert's idea that he always set out to write an ecological novel that was an environmental warning is revisionist. I think he revised that around 1969, 1970, when Dune was picked up as this kind of environmental book by the Whole Earth catalog. And I get into the sort of history of how that happened. And Frank Herbert speaking at the first Earth Day and saying things like, "Oh, I wrote Dune because it sounded like doom, and I wanted it to be an ecological warning." And it's like, well, No, because if you go back to the way he was pitching it to John Campbell when it was serialized in analog, there's no talk of that. There's no talk between him and Lurton Blassingame, his agent. There's no talk between him and Sterling Lanier, who published it at Chilton, the guy who bought Dune and made it into a novel. There's no talk of that. You know what I mean? It's a feature of the book. And all the stuff about Liet Kynes' father is in the appendices, right? That's not in the first version. The first version of Dune doesn't have any of that. Now, this isn't to say that he wasn't inspired by it, because he wanted to write about the real thing that was happening in Oregon, with ecologists trying to use seagrass to stop sand dunes from, but that's sort of like, that's humanity taming nature with a different kind of nature. That's not climate change warning. That's simply like, this is interesting that these people are trying to control their environment. So it didn't have a moral component, right? Like, there wasn't an ethical component to Frank Herbert's even nonfiction pitch. It was more like, I want to report on this extremely weird specific thing that's happening. Now, did he have an agenda when he was writing, when he wrote Dune World, which became Dune? Certainly. To pretend like his whole goal was to create like a ecological warning novel, I think it does the novel a disservice, actually. I think it actually kind of reduces it. But he said it so often, that we all just sort of bought it. And I think that, like, the analogy here I always use is Gene Roddenberry, who may or may not have met Frank Herbert once. Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, because Roddenberry was always like, I was always trying to create a more hopeful vision for humanity. And it's like, well, none of your pitch documents to NBC say that. They say that it's an action adventure show. And none of Herbert's correspondence with Campbell say that, this is, Campbell clearly misunderstood the subversion, and that's there. The subversion of the hero's journey and the political commentary, that's there. But yeah, I think that Herbert, he made good on his revision, because that is a huge aspect of Children of Dune and of God Emperor to an extent, in terms of, like how the terraforming of Arrakis and what that means, and how there's one sandworm left and all that. I think he made good on that, but yeah, I don't know if it wasn't the sole goal of the novel, and it's particularly true if you look at the first draft, Spice Planet, in which that's not a feature of it at all. That is just kind of a space opera.
Yes. Speaking of ideas like from earlier that have been around for a time, you referred to the newer books by Brian Herbert, who's the son of Frank Herbert, and Kevin G. Anderson, as quasi-canonical. And I was curious, in a world where there are many science fiction franchises where the canonical works include inputs from maybe dozens of different writers. I know, of course, you're very familiar with Star Wars, for example. So in your opinion, does Dune's, I guess we can say, tighter approach to canon make their expanded books more or less authoritative?
This is a tricky one. You're trying to trap me. You'll notice that I don't write a ton about those books in here. And the reason why I'm going to answer this in a roundabout way. I know you asked me a very direct question, but I'm afraid to answer it with a more or less. There was a version of this where I did a lot more on sort of those books, right? But I found that I was having to recapitulate so much of what happens in those books in order to even analyze them. Because I don't know if, for the most part, I try to kind of, if you've forgotten, here's what happens in Messiah. If you've forgotten, here's what happens in Children. And and with God Emperor and Heretic, even with Heretics, I describe the basic premise, right? Like in Chapter House, I describe how it ends, right? So, but with those books, I'm like, I don't know if I can spend 3,000 words just describing what all these books are about. Because I decided to take away and focus on the things that I felt actually changed the canon, like, significantly. And to me, that was the AI stuff. Because to me, that's only hinted at in the 6 books that we got. And that becomes the whole thing, right, in some of those prequels. And then in the sequels as well, in Hunters and Sandworms of Dune. And so, for me, I think the fact that you can choose to say it's the 6 Herbert books or it's the 6 Herbert books plus all of this, yes, it's less confusing than Star Wars or Star Trek canon, perhaps. But the analogy would be like, people used to be like, well, the only real Star Wars canon is what you see visually, right? And all the books are sort of whatever. And now, of course, there's two types of Star Wars canon books, of the non-canon ones and the real ones. Will they ever do that with Dune? I hope not. But I guess my question to both of you, I'm going to throw this one back at you guys, is that I often wonder if the Dune franchise would have been better off with expanded novels by various different people. Because they did that with Foundation with Asimov a little bit, right? And it's happened before, right? Things go, think about how many wonderful Sherlock Holmes pastiches there are by wonderful authors of different backgrounds. So that's my sort of like thing I'll throw back is like, I always wonder, like, I always felt that the Dune sequels were limited by the fact that they were just a Star Wars novelist, a very good one, Kevin J. Anderson, who's a great guy and good writer, and Brian Herbert, who's great, and there's some of the. I mean, I think that the first Dune prequel, House of Atreides is wonderful, but I have some. I think that there's just a lot in them that is not perhaps what the other books are about, and also there's a tendency to need to explain everything in some of those prequels. The origin of Lady Jessica's, that in particular, is I don't know if we needed some of that. So I don't know. But what do you think? Do you guys feel like we could have done with some different authors, exploring that universe?
Yeah, I've mentioned this in some of my other reviews of the books. It's not so much the different authors, but I'd like to see different aspects of the Dune universe. We've got this massive universe, and it's always the Skywalker family, if you like. It's always House Atreides. And now we've got, Mandalorian, huge success, Andor, huge success, which are veering away from, the Skywalker saga. And I'd like to see that more in the Dune universe, Fremen rampaging across the universe or anything else like that. Something going on in the Guild or the Bene Gesserit that isn't directly related to the Kwisatz Haderach. That's what I'd like to see more of in the Dune universe.
That's cool. I would love that.
Yeah, and I've admitted before that I haven't read all of the expanded books. So like I was like a huge into the original Dune books. Like I read them when I was in grade school pretty early. At the same time I was reading Lord of the Rings and everything. And then like I had sort of an awakening moment for Dune later on. And then I started to like see, okay, what else has come out in the meantime. And it seemed like there was a lot of like discussions online with people with wildly different opinions of the books. But like the ones that I read, like for example, House Atreides, like I enjoyed that one. But yeah, I would be interested to see, like as Mark was mentioning, maybe a different author have a take on something different on the universe, because we have this story, and it's it's the core of Dune, like the prophecy, Muad'Dib, like the God or Emperor, that whole journey. But at the same time, like it's a universe of a million worlds, and there must be so much going on in these different worlds, so many different cultures, like so many people must have different perceptions of how things are going on. So from my perspective, as long as it's approached like from the canon perspective, and the author is really like themselves a huge fan of the book, and they understand the themes, I would be open to that.
Yeah, I always wanted to, like, I always think whenever you have these kind of post-Earth science fiction empires, right, whether it's like Foundation or like Battlestar Galactica, right, where you're kind of like, what if you did a contemporary novel that's set in the Dune universe, and the Dune is just in our future, and you somehow, what I mean? Like, I always, because when you dive into the Dune encyclopedia, which is of course very non-canon, it has stuff like that where they're like, well, actually the Bene Gesserit started on Earth in 2000, and when it's like, wait a minute, that's cool. What I mean? I could imagine something like that, that I think would be really like the origins of Dune, like, but in like 1997, on our planet, in our timeline. Anyway, that would be my.
So you're saying ChatGPT is the start of the Heritage Jihad? Is that what you're saying?
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Funny story. I will reveal this. At one time, somebody suggested, I won't say who it was, suggested that we use AI to do the cover of my book, and I said absolutely not. I was like, there is no, I will walk out now, right now, if we do that. No thinking machines. Thinking machine shall not replace. Yeah. All that stuff's really fascinating. And it's interesting to be like, I always loved that Frank Herbert had that as a historical fact that was in such the distant past. Like, what a brilliant bit of world building to just not have robots in your science fiction empire and have a good reason for it. Yeah, I talked to the novelist Michael Chabon about this a bit because he stole some Butlerian jihad mythology for the first season of Star Trek Picard and put it in the backstory of the Romulans, that they were very anti-AI. And I thought that was really interesting, that everybody wants to steal that Butlerian jihad backstory and give it to some space empire, because it's such a cool way to then like slide past why you don't have a bunch of robots and other nonsense.
Right. So with Dune Part 2 coming out soon, hopefully, touch wood.
Yeah.
Dune fans are already, looking forward to an adaptation of Dune Messiah. And in 2021, I believe you spoke to Denis Villeneuve about his plans for a trilogy. So I'm just wondering what you think we could expect from a Dune Part 3.
Yeah, I think that Denis Villeneuve views it as one story. I think he views that as the end of Paul's story. And I think that I was one of the first journalists, I think, that he said that to. I could be wrong, because it was July before the film had come out. So it was pretty early. Yeah, I remember when he said that, I was so excited. And when Timothy had said that he was reading Dune Messiah, and what do I think that it would be like? I think that it would be potentially the greatest science fiction trilogy of films ever, depending on how great Part 2 is. You know what I mean? Science fiction film trilogies tend to have third part problems, right? We tend to think of the third parts of science fiction trilogies. Back to the Future 3, I think, is a great example. It's great, but it's no Back to the Future 1 or 2, Return of the Jedi, etc. I think that you could potentially be like, look, the Godfather Part 3, not science fiction, but we all can, I think it could be potentially, the greatest ever, because it would be like, I sometimes wonder if Dune Messiah shouldn't just be sold as part of Dune. And I know that that's nuts, because the ending of Dune is great, but like, to me, the story of Paul does kind of end with him walking into the desert, right? Blinded. Like, that is kind of the ending of his story. And yes, he's back in Children, and all that stuff. But like, I think that you could cinematically end the story of Paul with that image, right? Of him walking. And Denis had said to me and to others that, after that, he felt like the books got too complex, or too, they go into different directions in terms of the characters. So it would be not. And even John Harrison, the director of the 2000 Dune, said that to me too. He was like, we never really figured out if we were going to be able to do God Emperor, when they did Messiah and Children of Dune. I mean, that's what the wonderful thing about the 2003 Children of Dune miniseries is. The novelty of it is that they did Messiah. They did it. Yeah. They did it in like an hour and a half or something. It's kind of amazing that even exists. That it's almost like it doesn't. When you watch it, you're like, wait, they did it. They're doing it. He's getting the vision is wrong. All the cool stuff that happens in the book. But yeah, I think the return of Duncan Idaho alone as that kind of shadowy version of himself as hate is really cool. I think it could just be potentially one of the cool. I think it could be better than Dune Part 2 as a film, just in terms of satisfaction. I'm looking forward to Dune Part 2, but I will be very disappointed if we don't get what feels emotionally like. It feels like Denis views it that way, right? Like, he views it like, because as a child he read Dune in two halves, because the French translations were in 2 volumes, and then he read Messiah. So it makes sense that it's a trilogy to him, right? Because it's Dune Part 1, Dune Part 2, and Messiah, and that's it. And I think that, and it's almost like you wouldn't need anything else after that. You know what I mean? It would be like, that's it. I think it could be incredible. Will it happen? I don't know.
Yeah, I was just talking about this in our previous show. Like, whereas with Dune, like with two movies, you still have to cut a lot of stuff. Like as hardcore fans, there are certain scenes that we miss, and feel like they could have gone more into the characters. But Dune Messiah, with its length, it feels just perfect. Like for a cinematic adaptation.
Well, and you guys both know from reading my book that I'm a big Irulan fan, and so I think that you don't get the fact that we've saved Irulan for part 2. We don't get the full Irulan meaning unless we get Messiah. She's plotting against him in that one. It's this conspiracy. It's so cool. You get the whole story of the Reverend Mother coming back to her. Like seeing him in power is so interesting. And like, I don't know, you get Alia grown up. That we've only had an adult Alia once in that miniseries, in that sci-fi miniseries. So I mean that's also really interesting to me. And Alicia Witt told me in the book that she's like, I would play an adult version. She played the baby in the Lynch film, and she was like, I think I'm too old now. I was like, I don't know. You look pretty great. I think that would be awesome. So I don't know.
But bizarrely enough, for the Children of Dune miniseries, they were considering Alicia Witt.
Yeah,
Aaliyah. It's just it fell through due to a conflict of schedules and stuff. But
yeah,
that
which is
fantastic.
I mean, that would be great. Yeah, or like, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, there's a lot of fun stunt casting I've thought about with that. Like if people were saying, well, what if they brought back Kyle as some other character or something like that? I think it's all of that would be really cool. So anyway.
So long as we don't replace Bajaz with an Ewok, then you'll be happy.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Ryan, one point you touched on briefly in the book was the question of appropriation, and I've seen that come up. Doesn't come up often, but it comes up once in a while. And since Frank Herbert did take inspiration from so many different cultures and belief systems, and it's curious, right? Because science fiction and fantasy in general, it does draw a lot from real world elements in some fashion or another. And personally, like I've enjoyed seeing other countries reinterpret stories from my culture, adding their unique perspectives. Like for example, something we've seen done well with Japanese anime and games. My question is, knowing how many great works have been inspired by real-world peoples, isn't this a positive, or like where do you see that occasional concern coming from?
I think that what I tried to do with this subject was to go to the experts. You know what I mean? To go to the people that were the scholars, the academics that were actually studying it, which is why I talked to Haris Durrani, and that's why his interviews and some of his views are in there. And I tried to sort of really become a journalist in those moments and say, okay, here's what people are saying about this. And I think that Haris has the right view, which is that it's not appropriation if it's saying something. You know what I mean? There's been a accusation that it's Orientalism because Herbert was just using the terms to create an exotic sort of feel to things, and it's like, nah, that's not really true because he's actually like saying something. And so yeah, I think that could Dune be written today? Perhaps not. Perhaps some of the words would be different in terms of their Arabic derivations. But the fact that it inspires so much conversation about those inspirations, because, the word jihad is used in different contexts, as we know in the Dune saga. But that, something that I learned from a Muslim scholar like Haris is that doesn't just mean a war. It also involves internal struggles. And I was like, well, that's really interesting. Like, people should know more about that. So my answer to your question is, I think that Herbert was daring to draw on the different inspirations that he drew on. And that if you look at other science fiction of the time, it wasn't, in terms of galactic empire stories, they're not near as rich. They're not near as lived in. And I bring up Foundation again just because I think it's something that the show has done. Foundation is like a faux Dune, the TV show, whereas the Dune novels were taking what Asimov did and being like, let's actually make that seem realistic, and let's actually talk about prescience and precognition in a different way, right? Because like Foundation is like, let's predict the future, and that's interesting and scientific, whereas Dune is like, let's predict the future, and that's horrible. Right, like what's the ultimate end of the saga? There needs to be people that are invisible to prescience. The No ship is invisible to prescience, right? So it's like the opposite of like psychohistory and foundation. The difference is that, like, if you read the Asimov novels, they don't feel real. That world doesn't feel lived in. Herbert, by drawing upon different cultural inspirations, made his future empire seem real. And so I think that it gives us a richness. Those inspirations give it a richness that is totally absent, I think, in a vast majority of this genre of science fiction prior.
And this is really more of an open question. In your eyes, what is Dune's lasting legacy on the world?
I should know the answer to this question. I would say read my book and maybe there's an answer to that question. I think the lasting legacy on the world is that science fiction can be extremely mature for art form. That science fiction as an art form can be mature and lasting on the same level as another work of literature that's not science fiction. And I don't think that Tolkien did it with fantasy. He proved that fantasy could be that, right? And we've had a few works of fantasy since then that perhaps have risen to that stature. Maybe there's been ones of just high quality, but in terms of their perception, right? With Dune, I think there are very few science fiction novels, a lot of great ones in terms of quality, but in terms of reputation, that you can really have an adult novel that uses some sort of familiar, perhaps juvenile tropes, even, battling monsters in a strange land. You know what I mean? Like, on some level, you let your eyes go out of focus, and, you talk about the generalities of Dune, and it, even Herbert says, and, that, the sandworm was protecting the pearl of great price and all this stuff. That's my Frank Herbert impression. But have you guys ever listened to his really old audiobooks and stuff? When he describes the sandworm, it was the pearl of great price. But yeah, I think that that's the legacy of it, is that it said this can be adult science fiction. This art form of science fiction is complex and political, and it is an art form that is more capacious for adult storytelling than ever before. And that's saying something, because you had, Robert Heinlein at that point, and you had Asimov, and you had Philip K. Dick at that point. But I don't think that those guys probably wrote more individual good books than Herbert did. But none of them wrote Dune. None of them wrote Dune. Ursula K. Le Guin, amazing, absolutely amazing figure. She didn't write Dune. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's the thing with Dune, is that it's like The Hobbit. It's unbelievable. It's not like The Hobbit, like, at all, but in terms of its reputation and its legacy, it is. It's a massive work of art that is undeniable.
Well, thank you, Ryan. It's been our absolute pleasure to have you on this Dune Talk and to hear all your insights about the rich history of Dune. And I'm sure the Splice Must Flow will be a valuable resource for other Dune fans as well. So before we close, I want to give opportunity for you to talk about where people can find more about you, of the book, any other upcoming projects you're working on.
Yeah, you can get the book hopefully at most bookstores if you're in the US. If not, you can get it on any online outlet that you'd like. Yeah, and then I write for Inverse and Den of Geek, as Marcus said at the top of the show. So you can read my work there. I'll be covering Dune. I was hoping to be going to a press screening at this time of year, but now Dune Part 2 is next year, so I'll probably be babbling about Dune for a much longer, well into 2024. So you can read. You can find me on Twitter, Ryan C. Britt. I'm on Instagram at ryan.britt. And yeah, I'm working on a few different projects, but one may involve a certain British secret agent that is known for his specific way he likes vodka drinks. And another project may or may not involve a a detective who likes shooting cocaine. So you can guess what those might be about. Yeah, I might be working on some stuff, both a nonfiction project that may be about Bond and a possible Sherlock Holmes fiction project, but those are in the development stages.
Well, it was great to finally meet you, Ryan. Once again, an absolutely great book. Recommend it to everyone. Great stocking filler for Christmas coming up and Thanksgiving. And if anyone wants to follow me, I'm Dune Info on pretty much all the socials.
Yeah, this was Marcus Gabriel. You can find me writing at dunenewsnet.com and on X and Facebook at Marcus is Writing. Yeah, thanks again, Ryan, and yeah, thanks again for everybody who's been supporting this the show, all the new subscribers. We're going to have more special guests, more deep dives into different topics over the next few weeks and months as we count down to Dune Part 2. Just let us know what you want to see. Take care.
We hope you've enjoyed Dune Talk. Remember to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you know when the next episode drops. Stay tuned to DuneNewsNet.com and add us to your social feeds. Be the first to hear breaking news and reviews.